Welcome to this lecture, Voyagers from the Grave, a Claddagh Calamity of 1876 by John Cunningham. We're delighted in the Moore Institute to be hosting this event this evening. We've had more than 180 people register. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. So thank you again for joining us. Also want to thank David Kelly, who is running the show behind the scenes. He's the Digital Humanities Manager in the Moore Institute. Our chair this evening is Dr. Jackie Ichina, and Jackie, of course, is editor of the Journal of the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society. So I'm now going to hand over to Jackie to take us through the proceedings with tonight's event. Jackie.
Thank you, Dan. Much obliged to you. It's great to be here. Gur míle mágat as an cure. Agus fáilte we chuileáin atá seachnacht ó chuileáit chun tír agus thar tan na mílte chláirithe don leacht speisialta seo. I'm very grateful to Professor Dan Carey of the Moore Institute for agreeing to this collaboration this evening with the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society. We have regular monthly meetings, as most of you know. That's had to be put on hold because of COVID, like so much else. But we've kept our lectures going with recorded lectures. But tonight we have a really special treat because with the collaboration of the Moore Institute and with David Kelly, who is doing the technical work, as Dan mentioned, and with Dr. John Cunningham, a colleague of mine from the History Department at NUI Galway, we're actually going to have a live lecture. So I think it's a first for the Galway Archaeological Society. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's lecture. A couple of housekeeping points. Those of you that have questions, you're very welcome to submit questions in the Q&A function on the screen that you'll have in front of you. There's a button for Q&A and you can type your questions in there and we'll come back to them at the end of the session. Apart from that, just to let you know, we're live on Zoom and on Facebook. So we're really going global and international. And this is a pretty phenomenal story from the little bits I gather from John. He's kept most of it for the lecture, which is great. So I'm discovering as much as you are. So it's called Voyagers from the Grave, a Claddagh Calamity 1876. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dr. John Cunningham, a lecturer in history at NUI Galway. So over to you, John.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. And thanks to the Society for the invitation, to Dan Carey and David Kelly of the Moore Institute for the collaboration, and to you all for joining in. And a shout out in particular to descendants of the crew of the St. Patrick, the extended Moran and Smyth families, several of whom were very helpful to me in preparing this talk. It's unfortunate that we can't meet face to face, but that's the way things are at the moment. Apart from not being able to meet, another effect of the pandemic is that it's not easy to complete research with archives closed. So there'll be some gaps in my story tonight, so I hope you'll bear with me. The story itself, as I think you know, is an extraordinary one of survival at sea. Locally, I suppose we've been reminded in separate news stories in recent months of the courage and intrepidity of Claddagh fishermen on the one hand, and of the ever-present dangers involved with fishing on the other. So I'm here this evening to talk about this extraordinary episode, which lasted most of the winter of 1876-1877. The title of the talk, Voyagers from the Grave, was a newspaper headline about the event in a Melbourne newspaper, The Advocate. That gives an indication of how far from Galway the story spread in the spring of 1877. Another newspaper described the men who survived to tell the tale, as it were, as the three Shochrons. And that was a name that stuck with them for as long as the story was newsworthy. And I'll be talking about that later, or why that was. For background on the Claddagh, I have to acknowledge a number of writers, the Claddagh Dominican Father Columba Leahy, Peadar O'Dowd, Fidel Milan, and my late friend Alf McLaughlin. So I'll try to get you up on, get my slides up now and to begin. Okay, so you're able to see, you've got my slide. Okay, right, that's all right. I have to do a little bit of fidgeting here. Yeah, I think I got it. Is that all right? That's up. Right, so 4 men sailed out of the Claddagh on a hooker, probably of the Yawad class, to go fishing on the 13th of November 1876. However, they didn't get back till the 3rd of February 1877. For detail of the difficulties that detained them, I'm going to begin by quoting from 2 people who were there, as it were. The skipper, Michael Mourin, and his elderly father, Patrick Mourin. First, Michael Mourin. Yeah. So you've got the some of what he said in front of you there. We are fishermen of a little village called Claddagh near Galway, and but a short distance from where Father Burke resides. We're in the habit of going out to catch fish, which we sell in Galway. In this way, we support our families. I was the captain of a fishing smack, or hooker, named the St. Patrick. Thinking that we might make a good haul of herrings with Michael Smyth, my father Patrick Moran, and my uncle John Moran, I set sail in our 9-ton hooker on Monday, the 13th of November, and made for Slyne Head, about 60 miles from Galway, where we thought the fishing would be good. We had no extra good fortune, and at night, foggy weather overtook us. The wind sprung up, blowing a perfect hurricane. My post was at the helm, where my hands became frozen. On Tuesday night, the boat was half filled with water. It is our custom to light turf on setting out and keep the fire going. The water put it out. Although we had potatoes and fresh fish, we had no means to cook them. We were 4 days and 4 nights without eating. In order to break the speed with which we were driven, we lowered a basket filled with stones and endeavoured to heave to, but the cable broke on Friday morning. So that was Michael Moran. So I'm going to move straight to his father's account, to the account of a man probably in his mid-70s. That's Patrick. So the first night we were out, the weather was good and we set the nets near Slyne Head. That same night, the wind began to blow and blowed always from the east. We tried to work back again, but the wind always threw us out to the west. We let go of the mainsail and she went afore the wind with a double reef in her foresail. We couldn't get sight or sign of the sun and we sailing for nence the wind, always to the west. The second night we saw plenty lights, but there were jack-o'-lanterns to draw us out into the ocean. The third day was so high that the water came aboard the hooker and we were kilt bailing her out. I had a pan and young Smith had a gallon measure, but we couldn't keep her empty. In the night, we were all hugging one another by the way we'd get warm. On the morning of the 4th day, God bless the light that brought it, we saw a bark and they took us on board. So that's 2 accounts of the same event, really, from a father and son. And out of all the dramatic detail, I'm going to pick the most anodyne one, I suppose, on the face of it, which was Michael Moran's introduction of his community. We are fishermen of a little village called Claddagh. We're in the habit of going out to catch fish, which we sell in Galway. In this way, we support our families. So I'll devote about 5 minutes to the life in the Claddagh around in the 19th century, really. On the left, you'll see the sketch of a fisherman. Now, this is a sketch done in the 1850s, published in 1854 in an ethnological journal. And it's labeled only Moran. So it's certainly somebody from the Moran family. Michael Moran would have been pushing 30 in the early 1850s. His father Patrick would have been 50-ish. So you can make your own choice whether that's a drawing of a 30-year-old man or a 50-year-old man. Certainly it's a Moran and probably a member of that of the family. Okay, so I'm going to look at Claddagh then under a number of headings over the next 5 or 6 minutes, under the headings in front of you there on the screen. Now, Claddagh was across the Corrib River from Galway, outside its historic walls. It had a substantial population. A census of 1812 counted 2,300 people, which was something short of 1/6 of Galway's total population at that time. It was the only full-time fishing community on the West Coast. Other fishing communities were part-time farmers. And at that time, in the pre-famine period, it was considered the best equipped on the West Coast as well. Fisheries commissioners estimated that in Claddagh prior to the famine, there were more than 100 boats of the large hooker class that would have been around 15 tons, half-decked, and with hundreds of pucons of 5 tons or thereabouts. Despite the good equipment, life was insecure nevertheless, because fishing by its nature is insecure. Now, as a picturesque place, close to a big town, with the thatched houses, higgledy-piggledy, with the majestically sailed boats and the colourfully dressed women, Claddagh attracted the attention of writers, artists and commentators. Those outsiders, from the historian of Galway, James Hardiman, to Mrs. Carter Hall 20 years later, they tended to emphasise Claddagh distinctiveness and arguably exaggerated Claddagh distinctiveness. Now, I suppose Claddagh's distinctive Nestle in its the fact that its people spoke Irish, that they were practically endogamous in their marriage patterns, and that they were less inclined to send their children to school than were parents across the river. I've argued elsewhere that Claddagh distinctiveness has been exaggerated. Sure, the people spoke Irish, but so did the majority of Galway's pre-famine urban poor. Sure, they married within the community, but that had more to do with dowry arrangements than anything else. And as for the children not attending school, it was because career paths in Claddagh were mapped out, and one didn't need an education, so very obviously, in order to fish or to sell fish. Anyway, there's work for children to do, collecting bait and repairing nets, as we see in this image from the Illustrated London News. A reason for doubting Claddagh separateness would be the level of engagement with the town, and not just as a place to sell fish. Also, the very definite identification of Claddagh people as townspeople. A couple of examples of this will suffice. When Claddagh people elected their admiral and other officers annually on St. John's Eve, they engaged in a guild-type ritual, which is well described by James Hardiman, which included marching through the town, and not just through the Claddagh. Also in popular protests, including the periodic food riots, the Claddagh men and women were the leaders of the town crowd. They didn't simply turn up at protests, they took charge. And in this regard, the fact that they had their own designated leaders was relevant. Now, Claddagh people weren't organised into a kind of a trades guild in order to lead riots, but rather to make arrangements for their own working lives. As the only full-time fishermen, they considered themselves to be the guardians of Galway Bay. They set the dates of the fishing seasons, and they regulated the equipment that might be used in the bay, so as to preserve spawning grounds and fish stocks generally. They punished the Barna and Ballinacorty fishermen who broke their rules whenever they dared break their rules. They destroyed boats of the rule breakers and they administered beatings. From the early 19th century, however, there was a new threat to the fishing harvest in the form of trawlers operated by commercial fishing interests. The Claddagh people attacked the trawlers and also attacked the naval vessels that were sent to protect them, sometimes to the extent of having fully fledged naval battles in the bay. Claddagh people successfully resisted trawling for more than 40 years until the 1850s, but low-level resistance continued even after that, as a Claddagh Admiral, Podge King, explained to the writer Mary Banham in the 1890s. Right, that's the wrong, yeah, this is the slide here. I don't know if you can't read that fully, but I'll read it for you. So this is Podge King talking about the Claddagh's concern about trawling. Landsfolk cannot always understand why we are so bitter set against the trawlers. Here's how it is. Galway Bay is only like a shallow, sandy-bottomed pond. Us, with our wide mesh nets, just caught the fish. The trawlers come into the shallow seas with nets of big and little meshes kept to the bottom of the bay, with great bars that sweeps along and gathers up all before them. Fish, old and young, and sand. Now, mind you, the sand is weighted with the spawn for the next year. And then there's worse again. The Almighty gives great sense to all creatures for their own protection. The herrings that used to come in millions soon began to desert it and turn it elsewhere for shelter. I missed a slide there which shows the blessing of the bay ceremony. This is by Charles Whymper in 1888. This ceremony commenced at the autumn herring fishery and was conducted annually by one of the Dominican priests from the vessel of the current Claddagh Admiral. So I've spoken about the election of the Claddagh Admiral Mayor, who was later known as a king. So that happened on St. John's Eve. I've referred to that. Sorry, I missed that slide so it's out of sync, but I'll move on. Okay. Now, life being precarious, almost every opportunity was taken to earn a few shillings. One source of income was the Royal Navy, which welcomed Claddagh men into the Naval Reserve, paying them a small stipend and facilitating them indeed by organising training camps nearby in the fishing off-season. So from the beginning of the 19th century, when reservists were known as sea fencibles, to World War I, sometimes all of the eligible Claddagh men were naval reservists. When war broke out in 1914, of course, they were all called up. Now, I should say here that when talking about Claddagh, I'd normally be paying more attention to the Claddagh women and also indeed to the Dominican priests in the community. Sources on this subject, however, led me in other directions. And as said, the research couldn't be exhaustive because of the closure of archives over the last number of months. So you're waiting for me to go back to the 1870s or thereabouts, and the period we're focusing on. So I'll just give a brief account of circumstances in Claddagh at that particular time. We have an analysis, as it were, from John Brophy, who visited Claddagh in early September 1868 on behalf of the fishery commissioners. He remarked on the decline in the community since the period of the famine. The number of fishermen was reduced to 200. It had probably been over 500 in the 1840s. And the great majority seemed old to him. Middle-aged men were few, he observed, while the young were haggard and the old helpless and wretched. Most of the young and able-bodied, he said, were in America. Many of the Claddagh immigrants had ended up in Baltimore, Maryland, where they still engaged in fishing and where some had become prosperous. Brophy also commented on the number of and the quality of the boats. In 1868, there were only 3 of the Boyd Wara, of which there had been 100 30 years previously, and only about 60 Pukons, a fraction of what had been there previously. With crews generally made up from a family or an extended family. Some boats had been sold for a nominal amount when the family fell on hard times. Others were left to rot on the beach when crews were broken up by death or by immigration. This is from approximately the time we're talking about. This photograph, certainly before the mid 1880s. You can see the wooden bridge which linked Claddagh with the fish market in the post-famine period. There's talk around the mid 1870s of improving the wooden bridge, and then of course a permanent structure was erected in the mid 1880s. So, okay, where was I? Now, as for the cause of the decline which precipitated the exodus to America and the poverty among those who remained, the Fishery Commissioner Brophy blamed the famine and the disappearance of herrings from the bay during the previous decades. Other causes he gave were a lack of thrift among the people, who he said were in the habit of pawning their nets and equipment in difficult weeks and were often unable to redeem them when fishing conditions improved. He also mentioned as a problem, and I'm quoting here, the tenacity in adhering to absurd old customs, by which he meant the lingering opposition to trawling. So back to the crew of the St. Patrick and something of their lives before they headed off on that fateful journey in November 1876. One of them, we know, had emigrated to the United States. This was Patrick Moran, the father that we've quoted already. By his son's account, he'd fished for shad out of Fort Lee, New Jersey. Sorry, excuse me. Oops, do I have anything to drink? Sorry. Just some cold tea. I'll keep going. So Patrick Moran then had circa 1850 spent a period in fishing for shad out of Fort Lee, New Jersey on the Hudson estuary. Shad is a saltwater fish which returns to the river in which it was born every year. And so the fishing season takes place when the fish are making their way up the Hudson River from the Atlantic. Shad fishermen set nets to catch their prey. So it's very different to the fishing that Patrick Moran grew up with in Claddagh. Anyway, he didn't stay very long. Now, Patrick's son, Michael, the skipper of the skipper of the St. Patrick in 1876, went even further from home in his efforts to make a living. He served upon this vessel you see on the slide in front of you, the Css Shenandoah, during the American Civil War. This was during 1864-65, when he would have been in his mid-30s, early 30s, I guess. Now, this is the Shenandoah story, is almost as extraordinary as the story of Michael Moran's own boat, the St. Patrick, because the Shenandoah was one of the most notorious vessels of the 19th century. The ship was acquired by the Confederate Navy from its British owner in 1864 and refitted as an armed cruiser. Its mission was to disrupt the Union economy by attacking vessels engaged in trade with it. Under its captain, James Waddell, the Shenandoah operated out of Liverpool, England. In pursuit of its prey, mostly Yankee whaling vessels, it circumnavigated the globe during its 12 months in service. It captured at least 38 vessels and scuttled most of them. The war ended in May 1865, but the crew of the Shenandoah didn't hear about it, not until August, 3 months later. So they continued during those months with their depredations. The ship eventually surrendered to the American consul in Liverpool in November 1865, in what was reputedly the last act of the American Civil War. Under the terms of the surrender, crew members were paroled by the US government. Because there was some doubt about the culpability of the non-Americans, the crew gave addresses in the southern states of America, and probably false names to go with them. So the likelihood is that following this surrender to the American consul, Michael Moore went straight back to the Claddagh. I got water since. Okay, now I haven't been able to discover anything of John Moran, except that he was probably older than Patrick, perhaps in his late 70s. The newspaper said he was 90, but that seems implausible. There's other reasons to think maybe that men were in their 70s. Now, regarding Patrick Smyth, the fourth and by far the youngest of the crew, there's some information. He was 21 and married just 3 months before the fateful voyage to Margaret McDonough of Long Walk. In official documents, he gave his occupation as sailor, unlike his father Patrick and other relatives and neighbours who describe themselves as fishermen. This is consistent with his later employment as a pilot in the bay. The family memory is that he was a last-minute addition to the crew of the St. Patrick on the morning of 13th of November. There's also a family tradition mentioned to me by his great granddaughter, Mary White, that he disliked school and that one morning, while he was still quite young, he hid under the bed to avoid facing John Ryan, the schoolmaster in the Piscatorial School. When his mother found him, she gave him a choice: go to school or go out fishing. So thus he ended his school days without learning to read, though he was otherwise multi-skilled and talented by all accounts. So we left the St. Patrick at the point where a larger vessel had spotted them. This, it transpired, was a Swedish ship named by Michael Morin as the Georgian, and its captain was named as P. Olsen. It was, however, a few hours too late for John Morin, as his nephew Michael recalled it. While we were asleep towards morning, he must have been drowned by the lurching of the ship throwing him into the water. At any rate, we could discover no trace of him. Now, as the sailors pulled the 3 survivors aboard, Patrick Moran was painfully injured on his inside, he said himself. This was sometime on Friday, the 17th of November. The Georgian was bound for Hampton Roads, where Virginia meets North Carolina around Chesapeake Bay. There were navigational difficulties due to ice, so 16 days elapsed before the Georgian berthed at Norfolk, Virginia on the 6th of December. The only account there is of the voyage was from old Patrick, who teased Michael Smyth in the presence of a journalist, showing, I suppose, that his ordeal hadn't deprived him of his sense of humour. But that young man there is out of his mind about a girl at home. At night aboard the bark, he's shouting out for Mary Ann as loud as a whale would blow. And the divil of one of them would wake himself, but he'd wake me always. One night, and he dreaming away about his Mary Ann, I couldn't stand the noise of him. So I woke him up. Says I, you know the woman is alive, you're alive yourself, so what more are you asking? And then he gave a grunt and turned over and began to howl again. He's afeared one of the lads in Claddagh will be walking off with his own Mary Ann, but the divil a fear. It wasn't a Mary Ann, as it happened, that young Smyth was concerned about, was dreaming about. Margaret, in fact, was the name of his 19-year-old wife. So while all of this was going on, there was great consternation back in Claddagh. The Galway Vindicator, the nationalist newspaper, briefly reported on a missing crew 2 weeks after the departure of the St. Patrick. I don't know if you can make out the short report. See, it's very short. Nobody's named. And a week later, a slightly longer report brought the news that 3 of the missing men had been picked up by a passing vessel and that they were safe in America. The second report also tells us that all 4 had been waked in Claddagh, and that this was something the newspapers picked up on again later. So there's what it tells us about the wake in Claddagh. The fishermen were so implicitly considered lost that their effigies were in accordance with primitive custom in vogue in that isolated community, waked by their relatives and friends in Claddagh. So that's a fuller report a few months later. Now, I suppose this is interesting in shedding light on funerary practices when the corpse isn't available, as it were. I made some inquiries from folklorists about this, and my recent colleague, Pádraig O'Haley of Ren na Gaeilge at NUI Galway, had found references in folklore to something similar in the Iveragh Peninsula in West Kerry, as happening when there was no corpse to mourn. There, the folklore tells us that clothes and blankets belonging to the person believed dead, or perhaps who was buried elsewhere, an immigrant to America, would be placed on the table where they would have been laid out. And later, a photograph might also been later on, when photographs became generally available, a photograph might be placed there also. It would be interesting to discover if the Claddagh effigies were more substantial than that. So anyway, across the Atlantic to Norfolk, Virginia. From there, somehow, the 3 made their way to New York. In New York, a representative of the Boston Pilot, found them near the bright fire of a boarding house in Hamilton Street, which would have been on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Galway's ancient mariner, as the journalist called him, was in a bad way, coughing most violently, looking a wreck, said the journalist, and reflecting. When I left America 25 years ago, Sarah, one of me, thought it's this way I'd be coming back again. It's hard telling what'll come to a man afore he dies. The Mourins knew people in New York, but they didn't know how to make contact with them. And it was well into January, when they were speaking to the Boston Pilot, that was a whole month after they landed in Norfolk. Michael Mourin later mentioned a Galway man, a Mr. Webb, as having assisted them. Webb had an address in the Grand Union Hotel in New York, and it may have been him that arranged the meeting that took place between Michael Moran and the British consul in New York. I'm hypothesizing here, but I think it is likely that it was the consul that arranged a passage to Queenstown for the men on the 27th of January, 1877, and they arrived in Julie in Queenstown on the 2nd of February, 1877. By that time, the remarkable story was widely known. The interview with Michael Moran, published in the New York Herald, was picked up by papers in Ireland, in Britain, and even, as I said earlier, in Australia. The headline of the story in the New York Herald, "The Three Chaperons," was also picked up in the papers around the Anglophone world, and that was the name that came to be applied to the three survivors. So what's this about? What are the chaperons about? Now, the Chaperon was a play by the Dublin-born actor, playwright and impresario Dion Boucicault. Boucicault, whose unusual surname is of Huguenot origin, had his first play staged before he was 18, and he had a run of successes in Covent Garden before becoming popular in the United States. Boucicault's best remembered play is the Colleen Bawn, staged in the Black Box in the last couple of years. That first went on in New York in 1860 and subsequently played throughout the English-speaking world. Now, the Chaperon, the play that concerns us here, was first staged in New York in 1874, where it was a major box office success. It transferred to London in 1875, so the word itself had a certain resonance by 1876. I'll briefly talk about the plot of the Chaperon. The central character, Robert Folio, had been transported as a Fenian to Australia from where he escaped. There is a suggestion of a miscarriage of justice. It's not even clear that he was a Fenian. And the manifest injustice in the case seemed to support a Fenian narrative about perfidious Albion. And there were efforts by opponents of Irish nationalism to prevent performances to have it banned. Now, the Chaperon of the title, the poacher Con the Chaperon, was an ally of Folio or Folliot. I'm not sure how to pronounce how it was pronounced in the play. And it is he who delivers many of the play's comic lines. Con fakes his own death and secretly attends his own wake and funeral in order to eavesdrop on the villains of the piece. So it would seem that the phrase was applied to the three Claddagh fishermen because they had been waked and mourned without having actually died. And perhaps also because they were wanderers. Chaperon is translated as vagabond on the poster here in front of me. You may not be able to see that part of the poster. And that's contemporary, that poster is contemporary with early productions of the play. The Irish word is chaperoni, meaning a wanderer. There's a phrase, imi ar chaperon, meaning to go astray. And the expression on the chaperon was widely used in Hiberno English till recently. It even crops up in Joyce's Ulysses. The play, The Chaperon, reached Galway during the absence of the Morans and Smyth, playing for 5 nights from the 4th of December in Black's Hotel in the Square, where it attracted the largest audiences remembered by the Galway Vindicators reporters. Now, the three chaperons, as they were now called, and as they even began to call themselves, arrived in Cork on the 2nd of February. While there, they were looked after by Alderman Daniel Nagle, who was recently the mayor of Cork, who had a whip around for them, and this yielded £7 and 10 shillings. He gave the 3 men half of it and promised to send them the rest via a priest in Galway. From Cork, they were able to travel by train to Galway, and it was late on Saturday night, the 3rd of February 1877, when they arrived in Claddagh. We can assume there were tears of welcome and tears of loss for John Moran, joy mixed with sorrow. Evidently, there was a considerable celebration, but we don't have any details about it. But that wasn't the end of the adversity. There was more tragedy to come. When the celebrations were over, obviously there was the matter of the loss of the St. Patrick to be faced. The Mourins had lost their means of livelihood, which was obviously worrying for the entire family. There were desultory efforts at fundraising, which were reported upon in the local papers. But 3 weeks after their return, there's still only 6 or 7 contributors to the fund that was managed by a Father Graven, not enough to buy a new hooker. The contributors included Mr. Webb in New York, who sent a $5 through the Dominican priest and celebrity preacher, Father Tom Burke, Galway man, whose statue stands down by the Claddagh to this day. And also Alderman Nagel, who sent up the remaining few pounds from his collection in Cork. A possible reason for the poor response to the appeal is suggested in a letter to the Galway Express sent by Michael Mourin, one of the chaperons, as he described himself. He was addressing a rumour which had been published in the Galway Vindicator and the Galway Express. The rumour anyway was that the chaperons, as they were calling them, were practically rolling in money. So there's Michael Moran's letter. Sir, I hope you'll be so kind as to contradict the statement which appeared in the Express of Saturday last relative to the 3 poor fishermen who were wrecked in November last. It was stated they received £200 in America, the proceeds of a concert given for their benefit. I beg leave to assure you, sir, that such is not the case. We received no money in America, nor was there any collected for us. But one gentleman, Galway man named Mr. Webb promised to make a collection for us and send the money to Father Burke for us. The only money we received was £7.10, which was collected for us by Alderman Nagel in Cork, for which we are very thankful. And this is the only sum we receive. I trust you will be so kind as to put in an appeal in your paper for us, as I am entirely destitute, having lost my boat, my only means of survival for myself and my young family. And I am all the support of my aged father, who was with me through all the suffering, though he is 86 years of age. Again, perhaps an exaggeration. I again ask you, sir, to appeal to the charitable public on my behalf, so that in order that I might be able to, after some time, to purchase a boat so that I could support my wife and long family. Trusting in your charity to do this for a poor man, I will pray that God's choicest blessings may descend on you and your family. I remain, sir, your humble servant, Michael Moran, one of the chaperons. Now, so the loss of the boat then for the Morans was bad enough, but the loss of their main breadwinner soon followed. Michael Moran died of a heart attack in April 1877, just 10 weeks after getting back home. He was recorded as 50 years of age, and we can assume that the terrible ordeal of mid-November hastened his end. His father, Patrick, who was visibly feeble to the Boston journalist, outlived him, but he had a hard time before dying in the workhouse hospital in mid-July 1878 at the estimated age of 75, which is probably closer to the truth maybe than 86. This is the era before births aren't recorded officially until 1864, so people are fairly approximate about their ages if they were born before that. And life for young Michael Smyth was no bed of roses either. Very soon after his return, around April, his wife Margaret, with whom he was so besotted, was diagnosed with TB. She lived for 9 months before her death in January 1878. So Michael Smyth was a widower at 22 years of age. So there was no happy ending to the story of the 3 chaperons. Thinking about it all, a few issues might be raised. First, might strike one that there was a degree of foolhardiness in heading off in mid-November with the crew half composed of men in their mid to late 70s. Would they have lost control to the same extent with an able-bodied crew? Some sailors out there on Zoom might be able to answer that. But I suppose if we place it in the context of the decline of the Claddagh described by John Brophy, whom I quoted earlier, it's more understandable. With a declining and aging population, the old men were pressed into service to keep the fish, to keep the sea, or to keep the boat in action. And Michael Smyth was recruited seemingly at the last minute. Another issue that arises was the apparent lack of charity shown by middle-class Galway towards the distressed men, the chaperons as they like to call them. The rumour of the £200 in America was one factor in reducing the amount of assistance that they got. But I think it was only a part of it. More generally, the Galway middle class was suspicious of Claddagh, with local media and commentators from Hardman forward representing them as superstitious, lazy and crafty. And that was perhaps how the local press could blithely give legs to an unfounded rumour about the resources that the men had without thinking about the impact it would have in the relief effort for them. Am I right in also discerning a degree of condescension in the way the relief was handled? Both Nagle in Cork and Webb in New York, that we are aware of, sent money they collected to priests rather than entrusting it to the men themselves. And I mean, these are people of some substance, Michael Mourin having had a boat worth £200. More generally, in relation to the media coverage, the researcher is forcibly reminded of the differences between the American media culture of the time and the Irish. Both Boston Pilot and New York Herald sent out reporters to interview the three men. Ferdinand, the editor of the Galway Vindicator, was happy to reprint the American stories, but doesn't seem to have seen any reason to send someone down or to go down himself to Claddagh to talk to the people down there about it, or even to name the missing men in the earlier accounts. The new journalism of the era, which reached out to working class readers and to women indeed, by focusing on human interest and giving prominence to interviews, hadn't yet reached Ireland to any extent. Have I got any more slides? Oh yeah, sorry, just a moment. Finally, just before I finish, I want to look briefly at memory and legacy, as it were, of the episode. There certainly wasn't a lot passed down through the generations of the Moran and Smyth families. In the case of the Morans, certainly, with the deaths of all of those involved very soon afterwards, this is hardly surprising. And Stephen Moran, the great-great-grandson of Michael, recalled his grandfather, his own grandfather, Stephen too, talking about the men who were waked twice. But there wasn't any detailed information beyond that. As Stephen Moran said, it's not surprising that men who had to face the sea wouldn't dwell too much or talk too much about past tragedies. A few documents on the slides here show that the Moran maritime tradition and indeed the connection with the Claddagh was maintained. We can see the skipper's certificate on the left of the screen of Michael Moran. That's the son of the skipper who was about 13, 14 when his father died. So he became a skipper of a fishing vessel and was qualified skipper of a fishing vessel. There's also documentation relating to the naval service of Stephen Mourin, one of the Claddagh naval reservists who became a full-time sailor during the First World War. So he's the grandfather of Michael Mourin, the skipper of the St. Patrick. And there's a picture, I don't know if you can see it at the side, a picture of the house that on St. Dominic's Road that Stephen and his wife Ellen and their family moved into in the new Claddagh in the 1930s. This family still had that house until very recently, and thanks to Stephen Moran, to Mike Moran, and to Joe McGinley for the documents here, and indeed for the insights. As for Michael Smyth, we know he was widowed. Hang on, again, right, here we are. We know he was widowed, but he remarried at the age of 23. His second wife was Mary Turk of Woodkey, who you see in the centre of the slide. She's the aunt of the leading Galway Republican Commandant Sean Turk. We also see Michael himself in old age on the left of the screen, and we see Michael's pocket watch, which is an heirloom in the which has been passed down in the family. Michael lived a long life in Lower Fair Hill until he died at the age of 84 in 1937. He was a sailor rather than a fisherman, and he worked mostly as a ship's pilot in the bay. In his family, he's remembered as a small and fastidious man who was a good cook and who never drank or smoked. His great-granddaughter, Mary White, remembered a story this story that I'm telling here being covered by the Evening Herald when she was a child. But she says few people she has told it over the years have believed it. So I hope you believe me. I located the piece in the Evening Herald, which appeared in 1960. And it was written by a journalist, Sean Pjonder, who specialized in writing historical articles and who seems to have come across it in the Boston Pilot, the interview I mentioned in the Boston Pilot. Otherwise, the story of the Claddagh chaperones didn't seem to have entered public consciousness since. Finally, with regard to Michael Smyth, among his descendants was a grandson, also Michael Smyth, named after him, who was a Labour councillor who served as Mayor of Galway in 1971-72. And for those details, I have to thank Mary Smyth, Angela Smyth, and Mary White, great granddaughters of Michael Smyth. So I think I've detained you long enough. So I'll leave it at that. Though I will, before I do finish, I'm going to move on to another slide here, which gives some of the sources that I've used and which you'll probably be able to look at if you want to when this goes out on YouTube, and it'll remain up on Facebook. So I'll leave it at that then and try and get out of my slides. Okay, I think I did that.
Hey, thank you, John. That was fascinating. What an amazing story. I'm sure there are lots of people with questions, and I'm sure, John, you've agreed to take questions. So if anybody wants to add a question following on from the lecture, you can do so in the Q&A section of the screen, which you should have in front of you. There was one question, John, if I could just put this one to you, from Joe McGinley. He was referring to Patrick Moran, the father's account, and he says, what did he mean by jack-o'-lanterns? Do you have any idea?
That's a kind of, it's kind of, I suppose, the false lights, essentially, or imaginative. I suppose it's static electricity, essentially.
Right, okay, yeah. And there was a couple of comments as well on the Facebook account. one of the comments from Atrasa O'Carroll, who said that she remembers during the last time of the Galway, the Volvo Ocean race, that she remembered being told this story from somebody from the Claddagh who knew the story.
Oh yeah, great.
So yeah, which is great, but what astonishes me, I suppose, is that there isn't more people who knew about it. I certainly hadn't heard about it, and I very much doubt if many know the detail of it. So that's an interesting point, maybe, as to why it hasn't had as much traction as other stories. And there was another comment from Colette Fury, who said that Galway Hooker Sailing Club are well worth following because they regularly have information on Galway hookers and sailing. I think that's very, very good advice. But maybe to come back, there's lots more questions coming in, John. So maybe while we have a look at those questions, one of the questions here from Eric Sandweiss, he says, was there any kind of maritime insurance industry for the Claddagh fishermen and their boats, even a homegrown one in the nature of working class building and loan or benevolent organizations? That's a great question.
Yes, there were loan funds from time to time, but they were generally aimed at tradesmen. And the impression I get from some of the documentation is online, but the impression one gets is that the Claddagh people didn't avail of them to any great extent, or weren't encouraged to avail of them. What the practice in Claddagh, which is referred to by Brophy, and which is also mentioned a lot in the relation to the famine period, is that the way people got out of a jam was by pawning the gear. And then you have the difficulty of getting it out of pawn. So when the Quakers intervened in the Claddagh with welcome assistance during the famine period, the first thing they had to do was to release all of the, to redeem all of the gear from pawn. So that was the sort of recourse there was. Obviously, there was marine insurance and so on. Lloyd's was busy and influencing legislation indeed, but it wasn't. I haven't found any indication that they would have been ensuring the sort of craft that would have been operated by the Claddagh people at that time, which, as Brophy again pointed out, by the 1870s is generally quite small, with only a few of the Boyd's War in Operation 3, he mentioned, and mostly Pucons, the smallest class at that stage, though the vessel that given by the tonnage, the vessel that the St. Patrick seems to have been a Yawad, as far as I can work out from talking to Mark Lohan and others who were involved with the Hooker Sailing Club.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Thank you, John. Jim Lovett says, also called St. Elmo's Fire. Is I'm not sure what he's referring to there, but the jack-o'-lanterns were probably carved out gourd, similar to pumpkins. They may have had candles in them, probably left over from All Hallows Eve. That's a very interesting point.
But I think in this particular context, it's not. It's imaginary lights rather than actual jack-o'-lantern.
Yeah, that's the point that's been made there. Yeah. Just a question there from John Cunningham. I don't know, is that John Cunningham asking John Cunningham a question there?
John is my favorite, one of my favorite first cousins.
Let's keep it local. So very good.
And John is from Claddagh.
Okie dokie. So he says, is Morin's house in Dominic's Avenue or Dominic's Road? It was all called Dominic's Terrace, including parts of Father Burke and Father Griffin's roads back then. There were Morins in both the road and the avenue. So that's very much a local question.
Yes, I can't answer it. So perhaps some of I know the house was only passed out of the Morins fairly recently. So I don't actually, I can't answer just now, but I'm sure we can find out.
There's another question there, John, from Sean Duggan. He says, is there any memorial to the three Shockrons in the Claddagh? From what you're saying, it doesn't sound like there is.
Oh, there isn't, no.
Yeah.
There isn't. There is the monument that's there opposite Claddagh is relates to the tragedy of 1902 when 8 young men, mostly young men, were drowned off Kilcolgan Point on a Sunday evening. So that was a tragedy, but there is a monument to that, but not to this.
There was another question there earlier on, John, about were the fishermen's Irish speakers. Is that your understanding?
Oh, the fishermen were Irish speakers. Clearly, the dominant language in Claddagh, certainly by the 1870s, was still Irish. These men, 2 of the Morins at least, we know had spent time out in the world, and generally speaking, even back in the early century, when Gaelic is the language of the community, the men by and large were reputed to have spoken English, or most of them, which was about trading with fish with English speaking merchants.
Yeah.
But they're not exceptional. I mean, in this regard, the poor of urban Galway spoke Irish in the pre-famine period, and if you look at accounts, say, of the destruction of the tragedy and the Pro-Cathedral on Christmas morning 1842, was it? It's crowded because there's an Irish language sermon and the poor flock to it. But there are many. There's a lot of evidence, indeed, that many of the townspeople, also the poorer of the townspeople, also used Irish in the pre-famine period.
Great, thank you, John. There's another question from Nuala McHugh. Was a house in the Claddagh part of a fisherman's remuneration? I don't think so, from what I gather. But
well,
John?
The remuneration was whatever they could fish they could sell, really.
Yeah.
Which varied, what they could catch and sell.
Yeah.
And obviously their fortunes varied. So did demand. At certain times during the 19th century, there was fish curing facilities. The 1820s, again, the Quakers introduced curing in the later 1840s. So that there are a number of periods when there's more steady demand, if you like, for fish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a great question there from Lishak Nikostela. Hello, Lishak. What are the details regarding the Swedish rescuers? Has anything been recorded about them or about their interactions with the rescued crew? That's a really interesting question.
Yes, it is indeed, and it's one that I'll have to avoid. I did mention at the outset, I was down to give a talk to the Society, and it's just 2 weeks ago I changed the topic. I just decided I'll do this one. But there are a number of things that of lines of inquiry that I haven't been able to follow up, and I did make a kind of a desultory effort to see if I can find the Georgian, and I've tried to look online at the traffic in Norfolk, Virginia, but I didn't succeed in finding anything or any account in the Virginia newspapers of the time of the landing. So my impression is there was a report that they weren't the only people picked up on that journey by the Swedes, but that the others were obviously picked up close to off the coast of North America.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, Stephen Moran is providing encyclopedic knowledge here. The Mourins were 25 St. Dominic Roads and 4 St. Dominic's Avenue. The Mourins are still in St. Dominic's House. So they're clearly well ensconced in the Claddagh. Janine Woods has a question there for you. Fascinating talk. Not directly related, but the Piscatorial School, did it teach children skills for fishing and maritime work, or was it a general school for Claddagh children?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And there is an answer to that in Alf McLaughlin's wonderful article, which was published in a book called a small pamphlet called Two Galway Schools back in the 1990s. I mentioned that Claddagh people weren't inclined to send their children to school. There were schools before the Piscatorial School. The Piscatorial School was established during the famine by the Dominican. It was a national school with a kind of, which kind of dressed itself up as relevant by promising a piscatorial education, a relevant education. I think what really attracted the Claddagh children to school, or attracted kind of tempted their parents to send them, was the fact that a free breakfast was offered. I think that's certainly Alf McLaughlin's, the late Alf McLaughlin's opinion, that was, and that indeed that the efforts at providing the piscatorial education were often fairly token. The reports of the inspectors of national education on the teachers who served there through the later 19th century, there were lay teachers, were generally fairly abysmal, but and there's a general indication that it wasn't. There was another piscatorial school in Baltimore.
That's right.
And
yes.
It was part of a general approach in rural parts of the country. There was agricultural national schools trying to intending to provide agricultural education, and usually had a field or two attached. The school I went to myself, Castle Hackett, was established initially as an agricultural national school near Chewham. It was intended to kind of seem relevant. Alf McLaughlin's view certainly is that token efforts were made, and that the real attraction was the food.
Yeah, sure. Great. There's a couple of questions, excuse me. Mary Cunningham wants to know, how did they travel from Virginia to New York? Do we know?
We don't know. Is that Mary Cunningham in the next room?
I have absolutely no idea. This is getting very, very parochial. But she can ask you later on over a cup of tea.
I did incidentally just today discover that my sister-in-law was related to Michael Smyth. So,
oh gosh, right.
So, yeah, I only found that today. So Galway being the sort of place it is, we have connections and all sorts of.
That's for sure.
Indeed.
Don Carey, the landlubber that he is, has a few vocabulary questions for you. He wants to know what fornst is.
Fornenst,
yeah, whatever that is. And can you explain fishing smack? This is a boat, I take it. So
yeah, smack is Michael Smyth describes his boat as a smack or a hooker. So a hooker is not a word, would probably have another meaning in New York. So I think that's why that appears there in the New York Herald. Fornenst, I think, is the word, I think, originates in the lowlands of Scotland, and it means kind of it's a direction. I forget what direction, but yeah, Fornenst is from Lallands. Yes.
There's a great question here. Thank you, John. The great question from Tina Concannon. She says the photo of Wolftone Bridge in the 1870s is a very special photo. There's so much detail. Is it possible to get a copy of that photo somewhere?
Yeah, I think that's fairly widely available. Is that one in the collection that you were looking at, Jackie?
I think it is. I think it's the one, the Chetham's library collection. Yeah, it is. So the Chetham Library in Manchester would be the source for that photograph. They have a lot of really fantastic collection of photographs, black and whites, most of them taken in the 1850s and 1860s, but some of them a little bit later. But they're wonderful. They're absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, it's also in my book, The Town Tormented by the Sea, but that's out of print now, so it's not. But I can, if somebody wants it, I have a good quality copy here, so I can. If somebody emails me, I can scan it and send them to them.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, John.
That's the iodine, chimney of the iodine factory, which was established in the 1850s and which used seaweed to extract iodine. So it is a special picture,
Sure. There is a comment there.
Oh, sorry, I don't think I answered Mary Cunningham's question.
Oh, did you want to answer that? You better. You're getting into trouble. There'll be no more cups of tea for you, John.
I haven't found any detail of how they could have gone by sea or by. I don't know about the state of rail between Norfolk, Virginia, and New York at that time, so I can't say any authoritatively. Perhaps somebody else might have some idea. Perhaps Dan Carey might know.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm just going to take one more point really from John Cunningham, your cousin.
Yes.
In the 1920s, Beattystown, Frenchville and Grattan Terrace were built for the ex-servicemen who served in the First World War, a generous kind of remuneration then. So that's an interesting point that he makes.
Yes.
I'm mindful of the time, folks, so I'm going to maybe put a stop to the questions at this stage, and then just on your behalf, thank Dr. John Cunningham, for that really interesting paper. It's a topic, John, I think you're going to be returning to, and I suspect more is going to be generated as a result of this. It's a really great story, a fascinating story, and my own, I suppose, closing comment would be that why did they go out fishing? I think desperation and poverty is probably the main reason. That's why people take chances like that, and they still do it today because they're trying to pay bank loans, etc. It's a tough way to make a living, and as I think it was Singh said, the man who makes his living from the sea is certainly a brave man, So it's a terrific story and well told. I think that the attendances tonight will give you an indication of how popular it was. So can I thank you on behalf of the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society. Thank Professor Dan Carey and David Kelly for providing us with the use of this facility tonight and all the technical know-how. David, thank you. Thanks to you all for joining on Facebook and Zoom. We had a max of 141 participants at one point, which is extraordinary. So on a Monday night, that's not bad going. So thank you, John. Thanks to everybody for taking part. Keep an eye on the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society website for future lectures. But then finally, Gurmita Mahagat, John, thanks so much for great evening's entertainment and very elucidating information on a really unknown story of Claddagh history. It's been really a joy hearing about it.
Thanks.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you again, hopefully sometime soon. Gurmita Mahagi, Slán go fóill, Ihuwa.